Chapter 6 Trick or Treat. I never will understand why grown-ups are so surprised on the morning after Halloween to wake up and find everything gone haywire. If they were half awake the week before, they would have seen us boys getting ready. Most of them don't even know it's Halloween until they read it the following morning or in the paper. We usually started our preparations about a week before Halloween. It takes a little bit of planning to cause all the confusion that we do. We like to play a good joke on people. Nothing permanent or destructive, but something that's funny when it happens to the right person. Anyway, that last week in October was a busy one for me and Caleb and the friends we hung around with. On Halloween night, we all met, with Clint and Myron and a lot of other kids over behind school. "Everybody got what they're supposed to have?" whispered Myron. We all said, "Yeah," in the crisp darkness. "Okay, then let's split up and do our different jobs. Remember, back here at 9:30, and don't anybody be late. If you get here early, just lie low in these bushes. Don't make any racket or we'll all get caught. And by 9:30, things ought to be popping around here pretty good." Earlier in the week, me and Caleb and Dink had been assigned to the 2 blocks on Kimbrough Street, just north of Main Street. And that's where we went, as fast as we could. Seeing all the other groups heading off on their own missions gave us a feeling of being a part of some big scheme, like in a war or something. Our area was made up of old 2-story houses, sitting back from the street a good long way. There were a lot of big maples and elms which were supposed to provide us with some cover. "Just look at all those cars parked along the street," commented Caleb hungrily as we got to the start of our territory. "You wait till I whistle here?" I asked. "I'll get caught for certain if you start too soon." "Sure," said Caleb. "I'll wait until I hear you whistle." We 3 split up, as I imagined all the other groups doing at about that same time. It must have been just a few minutes after 8. I started at the end of the street and began painting doorknobs with the bacon grease I had swiped from the icebox. I had to be careful, because most folks would be listening for trick-or-treaters on their front porches, but I'd worn rubber-soled shoes for just that reason. The first 2 houses went fine. I left the doorknobs thick and gooey with old bacon grease. I was just finishing off the 3rd when I heard steps behind me. I hadn't expected them at all, and I admit I almost chucked that grease can and lit out for home. Instead, I went over the railing on one side of the porch. I hit the ground as soft and as quiet as a baked yam. The footsteps walked right by where I'd been, and I just froze to the ground and listened. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Heavy feet moving through the house. "Yes?" I recognized the voice of Mr. Swarthope, who was the dispatcher of Harry Mangus's lumber yard. Everybody said he had a temper like a crazy man. I wished I'd run on home after all. "Twick or tweet," said some little kid. "Well," said Mr. Swarthope, "I'll treat, all right. I don't want to get tricked." He went back inside the house for a minute while that kitty waited at the door. "Here you are," said Mr. Swarthope, but I had no idea what he was putting in their paper bags. "Don't forget now," he called after them as they were leaving. "I've treated you. No tricks. No soap on the windows." "No, sir," yelled a little voice from the sidewalk. That's when Mr. Swarthope put his hand on the outside of the doorknob and started to go back inside. "What the Sam Hill is this?" he muttered to himself. There was a long pause, while he must have stood there and looked at his hand. "How do you like those little hellions, Edith?" he said to someone inside the house. "I gave them candy, and they plaster nasty stuff all over my doorknob. I hope that taffy pulls out every tooth in their mean little heads." I lay low until I was sure he had really gone inside, and then I took off for the next house. I got all the rest of the houses on that side of the street without any trouble. Then I started down the other side. I had gotten about half of the other houses done. when a great big cocker spaniel came leaping out at me from the driveway between the two houses. He barked like I was stealing something. "Hello, Bert," I said, as nice as I knew how. Nice old Bert, good old doggy. It calmed him down some, but the lights on the front porch went on, and I knew if I ran, old Bert would bite a hole in me without batting an eye. Mrs. Filgerson walked out on her porch and looked at me standing there in her front yard, hiding the can of grease behind my back. Bert was standing right next to me, pointing. "Why, Bud Wallings, what is it? Come back, Bert, it's all right," she said. "That sure is a fine old dog, Mrs. Filgerson," I remarked. "He sure is a good old watchdog, all right." "What were you doing, Bud?" she asked me. "Oh, I was just walking by, taking my little brother trick-or-treating. He's too young to go by himself, you know." I smiled, sweet as cotton candy. "Well, where is he? Bring him on in. I have lots of goodies, and your mother told me all about that clown costume she was making him. She said something about an Indian costume for you." Yes, ma'am. I tore it on a nail. And Caleb, well, he's down at Mr. Swarthope's right now and singing some songs he learned at Sunday school just for Mr. Swarthope. Oh, Mr. Swarthope just loves to hear Caleb sing." "Well, bring him on by here when he gets through," she insisted. "I must see that clown suit." "Oh, yes, ma'am, I sure will," I said. "Come inside, Bert. You should know better than to snap at children out trick-or-treating," she said. Bert gave me one look that told me he knew darn well I wasn't doing any trick-or-treating with that can of bacon fat behind my back. But he did go back inside. I thought she had me on those costumes. Mama had made them for us, and of course we had ditched them in the garage as soon as we got outside. I finished my job in a cold sweat, but anyhow, I finished. When I was done, I carefully stashed my tools in the hollow of an old elm tree that stood on the corner. Then I puckered up and whistled, twice long and one short. Then I waited. Caleb had heard me all right. Way down at the other end of the street, an automobile horn began to honk. Not off and on, but steady. Caleb was wedging sticks between the front seats and the horns. Soon there was another horn accompanying the first one, and in a minute there was one more. It seemed to me he was moving too slow. The people in the first house would be out, and after him, before he had finished in the street. I could just picture my little brother in jail. But when he got to the middle of the block, Caleb must have figured the same thing. All of a sudden, it seemed like the whole sky was full of automobile horns honking all together, like a glee club for cars, and each one was singing a different note. Down the block, porch lights began to go on, and I could just barely see people running back and forth between the street and their houses. "That does it," said Caleb, puffing up beside me. He threw himself down on the ground and tried to catch his breath. "What took you so long?" I asked him. Had to lock 'em so they couldn't get in and take the sticks out too soon." "So that's what they were running back to their houses for, the keys," I said. "Yeah. And it was right about 9 o'clock, too, wasn't it? I was on time," he asked. "I think so. We better start back before somebody starts looking for us," I said. "Well, what about Dink? Don't we get to stick around and watch him throw those rotten apples down from that tree he's hidden in?" "No, don't you remember? He's got to stay there till things quiet down again. We've got to hurry." I had thought that when we got away from our area, we would get away from those auto horns, too, but it didn't happen that way. All over town, the same things were happening, and some different things, too. We crept toward school through the back yards because there was too much activity in the streets by now. Cars were driving up and down, and little knots of neighbors stood out under streetlights talking. I didn't want to know what they were saying. We stopped in some bushes next to a garage where we could look out at the street. We were behind McLeod's old house. He was the one who used to shoot a BB gun at any dog who wandered onto his precious lawn. He might have been the one who poisoned Petunia. The unlucky thing about Mr. McCloud was that he happened to have a fire plug in front of his house. Right then, that fire plug looked like Old Faithful on a rampage. Water was shooting 30 feet in the air, and huge sloppy puddles were beginning to form all around the house. McCloud was out in front, trying to cap the hydrant with a garbage can lid. As we watched, he darted in and tried to force that lid down on the spouting water. "Look, Caleb," I said. "Look at Mr. McCloud." "Wow," said Caleb, right up in the air. "Clint did a good job with that fire plug wrench, didn't he?" I added. "He sure did." The water was climbing up over the curb by now because some naughty children or somebody had stuffed up the drain in front of McCloud's with paper boxes. Oh, it was like a circus getting through Harleyville that night. One time we looked out and we saw about 12 automobile tires rolling down Kimber Street without a sign of a car on top of them. Dogs were barking everywhere, and great gangs of little children were moving up and down the sidewalk, singing and eating their loot. When we finally got back, almost all the different groups were already in. The group leaders had to report to Clint to tell him how well things had gone, and I reported for us, since Dink was still up in that tree. When the last bunch of commandos had checked in, Clint told us to separate and get home fast and quiet, as the whole town would lynch us if they caught anybody. And I believe they would have, too. "Oh, and Harvey?" asked Clint. "How's your garbage thrower?" Harvey Willis had built a gadget powered by a stretched inner tube that could throw a wet bag of garbage 75 feet or so. "I think I got her fixed now," said Harvey. "You still got that wagon full of garbage?" asked Clint. "Yep," said Harvey proudly, "but I didn't get a chance to fire a single shot." "Well, take it on home and get rid of it. It's too late to use it now." "Okay," Harvey sighed. He walked home with me and Caleb since he lived in our direction. We made it safely back to our house, and Harvey came into the garage with us while we put on our costumes again. "You're not really going to wear those things?" Harvey asked us. "Yeah, we've got to," I said. "Our mama thinks we're out trick-or-treating tonight." "Well, you were tricking all right." "Boy, I wish I'd gotten to use my catapult. It worked perfect all afternoon." "Hey," said Caleb, "there's somebody out in our backyard." We looked, and sure enough, there was a moving shadow down by my big oak tree. It seemed to be motioning us, so we went down there quiet as hungry roaches. It was Myron Webster. "Listen," he said, sounding worried. "I just came from Kimber Street. It's really something down there." "You betcha it is," smiled Caleb. "Dink's caught up in that tree. All the neighbors have their flashlights on and are standing around outside. He can't get down." "What'll we do?" asked Harvey. "You still got your machine?" asked Myron. "Sure," said Harvey. "Let's go," said Myron. "What about these?" I said, pointing to those stupid outfits that me and Caleb had just finished putting back on. "You haven't got time to change now. Let's go," said Myron. We snuck through the backyards to the scene of the crime. Some of the car horns were still blowing. Their owners must not have been home or something, and the neighbors couldn't unlock the doors to stop that honking. They were beginning to act kind of nervous, and some of them were holding their ears. "Which tree is Dink in?" asked Harvey. "That one," said Caleb. He looked really nutty in that clown suit. "I think I've got it," said Myron. "Look, Bud, you and Caleb, in your costumes, try to draw everybody's attention to the overside of the street. When you get a crowd, I'll signal Dink, and he can slip down and back there. Harvey, load up that cannon and be ready to cover us if we should have to retreat in a hurry." "I'm not going anywhere in this crazy Indian getup," I announced. "Me neither," Caleb agreed. "You've got to," said Myron. "If Dink doesn't get down, his mother will start looking for him and the apple cart will be tipped." "You've just got to do it," he repeated. From the way he said it, I realized that we really did. "Come on, Caleb," I said. "I'd have rather walked right up that elm tree and taken Dink's place than go out on that busy street in that silly uniform." But it had to be done. We made it out to the street without anybody noticing us. We went right straight across like we were just kids looking for an apple or some candy. We stood in front of Mrs. Filgerson's house. All the neighbors started watching us. I felt scared. They all stopped talking and just looked at us. "Hello, Mrs. Filgerson," said Caleb. "House cleaning?" Mrs. Filgerson had been working on her doorknob with a damp cloth. "No, I'm not house cleaning," she said bitterly. For a moment, I thought she might be planning on throwing that rag at us. "Some bad boys came to my house and put something smelly on my doorknob. You two wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Oh, no, ma'am," I insisted. "I've been home getting that nail hole sewn up so I could show my costume to you." Caleb looked at me like he thought I was crazy. "See, Mrs. Filgerson, I'm an Indian." I whooped and hollered a little bit, hoping to show all those neighbors that were watching us that I had the true Halloween spirit. My, said Caleb. "I didn't know you were so talented, bud." "Shut up," I whispered. "I brought Caleb to show you his costume too, Mrs. Filgerson. See him? This is Caleb, you know, my little brother. He's a clown, Mrs. Filgerson. See all those spots?" "Yes, I see them," she said. She was still suspicious, and I think the rest of the neighbors were too. "Come up here on the porch and let me have a look at those costumes. If you boys were really just trick-or-treating, I owe you an apology. Some little devils did all kinds of things around here." We went up on the porch, and she looked at each of us in our booby suits. "Sing some songs for Mrs. Filgerson, Caleb, like you did for Mr. Swarthope," I prompted. I was afraid she'd ask him about it, and he wouldn't know. "Do what?" asked Caleb. "You know, Caleb," I said, trying to laugh. "Sing some of those cute songs you're always learning at Sunday school." Caleb just looked at me. He was very angry. "Little ones to him belong. They're weak, but he is strong," sang Caleb, looking at his goofy pointed clown shoes. "Well, that's all right, Caleb," said Mrs. Filgerson. "Your voice must be tired from singing so much tonight." "Yes, it sure is, isn't it, Caleb?" I said. "Well, we'd better be going, Mrs. Filgerson," I said. "Mama might begin to worry about us. I just wanted you to see our pretty costumes that our mama made us." "Good night, boys," said Mrs. Filgerson. As we left, the rest of the neighbors closed in around her, and over my shoulder I could hear her telling them that we couldn't possibly have had anything to do with all those pranks along Kimbrough Street. I was glad she hadn't remembered to give us any treats, because I felt kind of mean telling her all those lies. We walked straight up the sidewalk so we wouldn't draw any attention to where Myron and Dink were hiding. We'd just made the turn at the corner when we heard an awful yell from down the block. It was all we needed to send us on our way, fast. We waited in the little park at the end of Rainwater Street, and sure enough, it wasn't long before 3 dark figures slipped across the road and started down toward our house. "Over here," I whispered as loud as I dared. The 3 of them joined us immediately. They were puffing so hard they couldn't talk for a little while. "What was that yell we heard?" I asked Myron Webster after I'd given him a moment to catch his breath. "McLeod. It was McLeod," said Myron, holding his sides. "He was the only one that saw Dink coming down, and he followed him into his backyard." "Then what happened?" Caleb wanted to know. "He got my catapult," grinned Harvey, but for some reason he didn't seem too disappointed. "You should have seen him," said Dink, laughing. "You just should have seen McLeod." "Why?" I asked. "We had to leave it and run," said Harvey. "My catapult. And the wagon loaded with garbage. He got 'em both." "Don't worry, Harvey," said Dink. "You can have my old wagon for saving my life." Old Harv let McLeod come in until he wasn't more than 20 feet away. He fired that contraption, and about 5 pounds of wet coffee grounds and banana peels and eggshells caught McLeod right smack between the nose and the chin. No foolin', I asked. Right on the old button, agreed Dink. He just stood there and spit coffee grounds for a few seconds, and then he yelled like a crazy man and started after us. Could he see anybody? Asked Caleb. No, said Harvey. It was too dark. We busted up for home then, and me and Caleb got a lecture for being 45 minutes late. Papa asked us if we knew who might have poured syrup in our mailbox, but of course we didn't have any idea who it was. Come here a minute, Bud, Papa asked just as we started up to bed. Let me see your hands. I had to show them to him. They were all greasy. Good night, boys, said Papa. See you in the morning. And the next day, there were all sorts of stories in the paper about flooded conditions in certain parts of town and about people who got hit with rotten apples. And one gentleman over on Kimba Street was even hit in the face with flying debris launched by some kind of machine that was now in the hands of the police. Many cases of greased doorknobs were also reported, concluded Papa, reading from the paper. He looked up at me. Next time, get that stuff off before you come inside, he said, winking at me.